This is the God, Man and Markets podcast, conversations on faith, culture and the economy.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Michel Akkad, and joined by Charlie Deist and Father Brad Elliott, and we're pursuing our exploration of the work by Ivan Illich called Shadow Work. And we're now on the last chapter of the book, entitled Shadow Work, in which he gives, to my view, a most apocalyptic view of the industrial age. He builds on the previous chapters. Um, but let me maybe spend 2 minutes or 3 minutes giving my take on what the chapter is about. So he continues to sort of indict modernity, and here he describes um, what he views as a departure, of course, from um, the way of subsistence, which was a theme that we broached in the previous episodes, right? Subsistence work, where families were more or less self-sufficient in what they did, and we saw gradually the imposition of top-down institutional takeover of certain functions, such as language, and then the technical arts, and that we saw on the last episode. And here he's going to develop the idea, which according to him, in the 17th, 18th century, this process sort of accelerates, and you have essentially a complete takeover. Subsistence work disappears for the most part, is replaced by wage work, right? Wage earning is becomes sort of the norm, and is viewed as a good thing. I mean, thing that families should aspire. And right, so under the for him it would be the pretext of economic efficiency, and so with the emergence of classical liberalism and the industrial work, you have people taken out from, you have the development of the enclosure, which he alludes to. I mean, he doesn't develop it, he mentions it as if it were understood that it was a bad thing. But you have the enclosure not only of pastures, but you have enclosures within societies. You have separations within societies, and particularly in the family, you have a separation between you have a sexualization of the division of labor, if you will, between men who become the wage earners and women who start to do essentially what will end up being the shadow work, meaning they do work that is not, properly speaking, subsistence work, but is work that is demanded by the industrialization, and that Illich, has no sympathy for. Sort of busy work, and and that leads to essentially. I mean, he's careful not to couch it in using Marxist terms, but you can use the term alienation, if you will, here, because it's no longer dignified. It's a top-down imposition from institutions, um, um, that really essentially destroys a way of life in which human beings can flourish, into a way of life in which human beings are no longer in charge of their destinies, but they're essentially splintered. So I think I'll stop here and get your reactions, if that's what you, the same idea that you had, and then we can develop maybe more other ideas that he brings up in this chapter.
Yeah, Michelle, I think that's a very good summary of Illich. This particular chapter of Illich is more than any other chapter. He kind of shows his cards as being a Marxian critique of society, and it is a Marxian critique. Um,
Of capitalism, let's say, of right,
yes,
of right,
yes,
yeah.
a Marxian critique of capitalism, but a Marxian critique of, particularly, even more than capitalism, social structures,
Hmm.
where he sees he sees the breakdown of society, or division of society into social structures in that with that metaphysics of almost kind of Hegelian dialectic, where there's a tension that's building in the modern world between the different factions of society, brought on by alienation, if you will. The human person is alienated from their work. The human person is alienated from his or her fellows, even in society. It's a tension that will lead to some kind of a resolution, and the resolution, it was sometimes some type of a, it's an evolving tension. And he from my take, he didn't really answer as to what he see. It is quite apocalyptic. He didn't quite answer as to what a solution might be in his thought.
Right. I see your point, and I can certainly see a Marxist reading of Illich, but at the same time, he's not Marxist in the sense that So I wonder, because to me he seems to want to essentially go back
Mhm.
to the way it was, as opposed to Marxism, which
Yeah.
actually views just capitalism as a stage and an evolution.
Yes.
And to the extent that Marxism is top down and institutionalized and relies on institutions, he's quite critical of that. So I'm going to be uh, perhaps more charitable to him and not call him a Marxist.
Well, I
Although
don't
he is a
call him a Marxist.
right. Okay.
I'm not calling him a Marxist at all, because he doesn't see, he certainly does not see capital. He's not like a Marxist of the strict observance, where capitalism is a necessary stage into
Right.
some kind of a future utopia. He
Mhm.
doesn't buy that at all.
Mhm.
He does see, he wants to go back to an era of more organic, more of a humane subsistence living, without Marx would call the alienation of the person
Right.
from their work. Yet, I kind of, when I say it's a Marxian critique, perhaps this is simply because of how I have been conditioned to receive this critique, of capitalism, this critique of the division of labor, even the division of labor within the family, as something that the modern world has thrust upon us artificially. And the division of labor ultimately is some kind of a, particularly I'm thinking between the sexes,
Mhm.
between the sexes, the division of labor, even between the sexes, is some kind of a tension or an antithesis that needs to be overcome. I'm always a little bit concerned when I hear that critique, and so maybe that's why I kind of call it a Marxian critique.
Right. That's interesting. So I don't know enough to be able to judge this, but it makes sense. But on the other hand, he at least in the latest incarnation of Marxism, if we
Mhm.
think about the postmodern Marxism and whatnot,
Yes.
you will have that critique, but then this again, it will come with a solution, which is the complete liberation by overthrowing all norms of
Mhm.
identity. Whereas I sense a traditionalist strand in Illich's thought, right? I mean, he wants to go back with. I mean, he thinks that there's natural, organic gender roles, right?
Yeah.
That
Mhm.
that are worth preserving. He doesn't develop them, but I think that's there, and in that sense, I don't think he's Marxist. So he is a critic of capitalism for sure, and certainly a critic of classical liberalism.
Yeah.
So what comes through, he has no sympathy for the progress of that classical
Yeah.
liberalism has brought about.
Yeah, you're
And
right. And perhaps it's unfair for me to say it's a Marxian critique. Uh, Perhaps it's unfair, and I'm also probably generalizing from my own experience too, of dealing with
right,
most of the critiques of modern capitalism that I encounter, of course.
right. But like you, I come from a perspective that tends to be very friendly to capitalism
Hmm.
and friendly to the at least some of the changes that came about during the Industrial Revolution, with
Yes.
capitalism.
Yeah,
But
likewise.
now I see them in a different light, and I'm sort of enticed by what's by by Illich's critique, because I think classical liberalism I mean, there are certainly many good ideas that are with it, but
Mhm.
it came with a certain flavor or certain assumptions. Um, for example, this, the work ethics, and so what he mentions here about wage being a wage earner being a thing that he thinks is undignified.
Mhm.
So it's almost like an answer to Max Weber, perhaps,
Mm.
and to that kind of the quote unquote Protestant work ethics, and maybe what Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment and how they viewed uh, capitalism as a cure for poverty,
Yes.
right? Whereas he thinks that there's nothing wrong with the social orders as the social order as it existed before capitalism, including people, having to beg, people having to live with subsistence, people
Yeah.
having, right? I mean, different forms of living,
Yeah.
um, and so. And that actually I thought was a little bit Aristotelian. Recently, I had a
Mm.
chance to read again the Politics, at least the first chapters, and Aristotle. I may have mentioned this on a previous podcast where he talks about the different social strata of his day,
Mhm.
including the beggars or the shepherds
Yeah.
and the brigands, right? And um and so who knows? So I'm not. I can't say that I'm I'm not convinced by Illich because he doesn't use philosophical arguments to make his case. He is essentially
That's right.
indicts capitalism, right?
Mhm.
And he makes claims about the way it was before, a more ideal
Mm.
situation before. Um, but at the same time, I think there's probably something to be said for his critique of capitalism, in the sense that it does come with a certain ideology that may look for institutions, even if they're private sector institutions, to sort of
Yeah.
drive a certain social change through efficiency and whatnot. And then historically, probably did get a helping from the state, right, for their
Yeah.
implementation. The capitalistic institutions were not completely free market.
Yes.
Nothing is completely free market. So they are
Yeah.
tainted by state intervention.
I think you're absolutely right. I think you're right. And yeah, I think, and as much of a pro-capitalist as I am, pro-free market as I am, I certainly, as a Thomist, as an Aristotelian, as a Catholic, you know, uh, I don't believe classical liberalism is without its own, uh, is free for a room for its own critique naturally. Now there did come, and I think he's right about this. It seems, and I think he's putting his finger on this. With the Industrial Revolution, there came kind of a tyranny of efficiency, and it
Mhm.
was a type of a tyranny of efficiency where there was a there was a there was a natural momentum towards the more and more efficient at the expense of an authentic, uh, real uh, evaluation of human life and society, because the the woven into this kind of tyranny of efficiency is this: well, the markets, the natural market forces will drive us towards the greatest amount of production for the greatest number, but nobody stopped to ask the question that I think Illich is asking. It's like, do we really need that?
Mhm.
Is that really what we, is that really, do we really need to change pre-capitalist society? You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
Is
Yeah.
it really something we need to change? Rather than simply bowing down to the tyranny of efficiency, we have to ask ourselves, well, wait a second, what's wrong with the modicum of inefficiency that was present in pre-capitalist societies that must be remedied? I don't know, and I think his critique is good. I think that's a very legitimate question to ask, uh, and many of the classical liberals didn't really ask that question.
Right. Yeah, I agree, because there'd be a natural tendency to answer that by saying, well, look at all the material prosperity and how good it is.
Exactly.
On the other hand, there's a lot of non-material poverty, spiritual poverty,
Hmm.
that we can point to, and I'm not sure to what extent um, the painting of pre-modern society as being it tends to be painted in very bleak terms.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I mean, clearly it's bleak when we compare to our material comforts, but maybe it wasn't bleak in other ways, and it's hard to make those judgments.
It's very hard to make those judgments. And I know in previous episodes, David Clayton has mentioned how he and myself, I have very little patience for academics who idealize the past.
Right.
Since it's so easy for us to project into the past our own imagined kind of almost a fairy tale utopia, and assume that the past was so much better than what we have it now. To a degree, that's probably true, but it's never as true as our imaginations will kind of paint it. You know?
I think one observation, just broadly, about reading Ivan Illich is that I always come into it feeling like I'm missing some kind of important context. And
Mm.
in this essay, it was no different, where he starts off immediately by referring to a book that's on his desk. And none of us, I'm guessing, have ever seen the book or read the book, called The Burger's Daughter. But apparently, it's a book about apartheid. And this theme of apartheid as this sort of the division of classes and the division of sexes. I thought he took it in an interesting direction, and I don't think that that Illich is a Marxist. And there are a few clues, to me at least, that show what I think. To use that same phrase, I think where he kind of shows his hand as not being a Marxist is when he talks about the uh, class struggle being a ritual that's used to mystify this transition that's taking place. That you have classes of victims whose representatives, this would be the vanguard of the proletariat in the Leninist or Marxist Leninist framework, that they take these victim groups claiming to be their representatives and actually end up oppressing these victim groups even more. I like the last line of the chapter where he says that. Well, I mean, again, there's so many themes here to unpack before even reading a single line from the text. But he talks about how this paternalistic dishonesty enables the representatives of the oppressed to seek power for ever new oppression. Um, right now I know that there's a lot of unrest in South Africa, which comes up in here in this chapter, and I'm guessing in reference to the racial apartheid that they have, where it's a separation of the races. I'm actually woefully ignorant of what actually happened under apartheid in South Africa, but you get the sense that Illich doesn't want to limit the definition of apartheid to racial apartheid, and he wants to say that, in a sense, this emphasis on wage labor around the world has turned all of us, in some sense, into slaves under an apartheid system, to the extent that we're operating under the wage labor system. Um, I don't know if either of you can kind of fill in the gaps of, what South African apartheid was, um, because for me that's a chapter of modern history that I really don't know very much about.
I am no expert on the apartheid.
Yeah.
I'm no expert, so I can't.
Yeah, but I think neither am I. But I think you're correct. I mean, he broadens the meaning of apartheid,
Mm-hmm.
and I think synonymously in this chapter there are two terms. One is apartheid, the other one is enclosure.
Mm-hmm.
So the enclosure, I referred to this a moment ago. It's the process by which, at least in England, started in England, by which common land or land that was in common between, for use for grazing between peasants and whatnot, became privatized, became enclosed into private properties that were then owned by landowners, as opposed to being land that was shared by the community, so to speak. And um, and that is frequently the sort of viewed as the historical starting point of the industrial revolution, right? You have private property, the land becomes more efficiently and more, because it's a private property, it's taken care of better, right? The production, the agriculture sort of improves. But then it has its social, it has its critics, and usually the Marxist critics, right? So the social ills of privatizing and of alienating the poor, right, and the peasants and so forth. So he uses both the South African apartheid and the process of enclosure, and broadens their own definitions or applications to seeing a division in society, a specialization, if you will, of roles within society.
Mhm.
So then he applies that first to the role within the family of men becoming the wage earners, and women, where he claims, I don't know to what extent it was true, that in the subsistence society, the pre-modern subsistence society, men and women had more or less made equal contribution to the subsistence, to the income of a family through their work, and therefore they were essentially on equal footing, even if the tasks may be different. They were on equal footing. With capitalism, you have this division of labor, with the men becoming the wage earners, and the women becoming relegated to a separate role, which ends up being the activity that will develop into what he calls the shadow work. That is not only unpaid, but it's unpaid to just support this artificial division that he attributes to capitalism. I like the term that you use, the tyranny of efficiency, because it these divisions are can make certain things more efficient, of course, right?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so that's all that I can say. And you're right. He brings up this, and it threw me off, because at the beginning, when he talks about this book by Nadine Gordimer about South Africa, I really had no idea what it had to do with the rest of the book, or this chapter. He comes back to it at the end of the chapter, but I think they're essentially just because he wants to use that phrase. So to what extent South African apartheid is, I mean, that's a 19th century uh, reality, right? I mean, it comes with colonialism, which you could also see as being part of the same logic, if you will, of classical liberalism and industrialization. So maybe that's one connection, that the apartheid, the racial apartheid of South Africa, is a natural extension abroad of the division of labor and the division of land and the division of this, um, for the sake of
Yeah.
efficiency.
I wonder though if he places the dislocation or the division between the sexes too late in time, because in Genesis you read that after the fall, um, men will have to work in the fields by the sweat of their face and all these unpleasant things, and it says that, I forget the exact language in the King James version, but something like the husband will lord over his wife, or will um, uh, the idea being that it creates this dynamic of husband having uh, an asymmetrical relationship of power with his wife, um, and that before the fall this wasn't the case, but as soon as agriculture comes along, we had some kind of a division there. But it seems like, yeah, he is focusing his attention on what happens after wage labor is really elevated to this special status. The sort of Protestant work ethic takes hold in certain places and just spreads like wildfire. And anything that doesn't keep up with that becomes deemed somehow inadequate. That if you do not agree with the German Calvinist or the Dutch Calvinist work ethic, then that puts you way behind in this race. And I can sort of relate to that on some level. I mean, I ran the rat race to some extent, and always, I went on to college to get a degree, and for most of my adult life, I've worked for a wage of some sort. But I could see how, I had friends growing up who uh, didn't thrive in a school environment, and then when it came time to go to college. They weren't interested at that time, or they weren't ready for it. And I think that this is where Illich talks about how modern institutions breed their own defectives. They kind of define what it means to be underdeveloped, or what it means to be illiterate or uneducated, and then by setting that standard, they make it so that if you don't want to play the game, then you're relegated to, you know, almost beggar status, or you have to then be helped by a new class of representatives, who claim to represent the victims, but more often than not, they're actually part of the same system, whether it's social workers or school administrators. There's this whole huge special interest today of people that exist to provide compassionate care to the underprivileged, without realizing that the institutions that they're part of are the ones that define what it means to be underprivileged. And that if these institutions never existed, then the underprivileged wouldn't even consider themselves underprivileged necessarily.
Mhm.
Father, do you want to comment on the? It's very astute points, Charlie. Do you want to comment on the biblical reference?
Well, I would just, I think, well, I don't, what Illich is doing is not, I don't, I think it's overstated to say that he is placing the division of the sexes during the Industrial Revolution. I think what he sees is happening around the Industrial Revolution is a demotion of what he calls shadow work into the realm of the obscure feminine, and is downplayed into the obscure feminine, which is devalued precisely because it isn't something that is immediately transposed into a monetary wage. And what I see this what I see him doing here is, so what he sees in the Industrial Revolution is a devaluation of the subsistence work that would typically be the feminine, and a devaluation of that, and the emphasis all on wage labor. And so, yeah, that's what I would say.
Right, but I think you're right, but I see I see your point, and perhaps maybe my answer would be, maybe he views in the pre-modern society, at least in the way he describes it, a remnant of the garden of how it
Yeah.
should be, right? I mean, ideally, and it's not perfect, and it clearly, after the fall, there was that division and that strife between the sexes, that we can read in history books, and in the Bible, at any point in time in human history. But perhaps industrialization systematizes it. I mean, he doesn't talk in either biblical or eschatological terms or whatnot, but
Yeah.
at some point he does here. I mean, he says modern enclosure apartheid is never just cruel or just degrading; it has always a demonic dimension. So, if it does have it, if it brings up the demonic dimension here, then maybe that's really the fruit of the labor of the serpent, right?
Yeah.
In his mind. So that's why, to me, it's a sort of an apocalyptic indictment or vision of industrialization.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Right.
I wonder what can be salvaged from the classical liberal tradition if we're taking all of Illich's arguments at face value and kind of conceding that economists often do miss the point, and that the obsession with efficiency and the assumption that more is better are misguided. I think that there still is something in the classical liberal tradition. Uh, Property rights, you mentioned, Michel, that when you have people with an incentive to improve their land, you get better results. You do get more output, and often that is better if you can produce the same amount of food on an acre of land without depleting the topsoil for a community. Then that frees other people from the backbreaking labor of agriculture and allows them to become craftsmen, or to study science. Maybe they can become the next Saint or Hugo of Saint Victor.
Right.
And I think that this is where I wrestle with Ivan Illich is on these questions of free enterprise. I do love the line where he says that economists understand as much about what is it? Economists understand as much about markets as alchemists do about gold, or something like that. Um, I'm just curious to hear your guys' reactions to that economists are really missing some kind of big picture with their focus obsession with efficiency.
But and this is where I also, Charlie, somewhat depart from Illich's critique of classical liberal economists or classical liberal economics' ability to do what it does within its own sphere of expertise. Economists are not moral theologians. Economists do what they do, and it, like any science, or it will give you answers within its sphere of expertise. I depart here from Illich in his kind of very harsh critique, even of wage labor necessarily. I right uh, I don't see it as the de facto evil that he does.
Hmm.
And I don't, and I see in Illich a thread of this idealism about the past, of an idealizing the past, which I don't really think he can substantiate, actually. But that's my
Right.
take.
You know what that brings to mind when I read this chapter. You know the quote by Edmund Burke.
Which quote?
You know, it's a quote from his book on the French Revolution, and the
Mhm.
quote is this: "But the age of chivalry is gone.
Uh,
That of the sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the
Hmm.
glory of Europe is extinguished forever." So I know very little about Edmund Burke, but but uh, I could see Illich sort of nodding
yes.
to the to this quote at least. Um, but at the same time, I don't. For some reason, I mean, Illich seems to be a sort of troublemaker polemicist, where my idea of Edmund Burke is, this sort of stodgy traditionalist.
Mhm.
Do you know anything about Edmund Burke to be able
I love Edmund Burke. I love his.
to
Yeah.
put this quote in context and maybe contrast it with what Illich has to say, or I mean, contrast Edmund Burke's thought with Illich's
Well,
view?
that's interesting. I mean, I can start. I would just be thinking on my feet. Of course, I haven't even thought about that. I love Edmund Burke's writing, particularly. I mean, his reflections on the French Revolution is a fantastic work, because he realized that we were entering the age of the revolution,
Mhm.
where the revolution becomes the model of change and the revolt against the past, revolt against tradition, and and that's why he is now set up almost as a straw man, as just this rigid traditionalist, because he recognized in tradition a he recognized in cultural tradition a repository of information that society needs to function properly. And the very model of change that the French Revolution brought about, or was maybe perhaps a symptom of, was the model of change where all of a sudden now the specialist, the technician, the scientist becomes that high priest of the information that society needs. It's no longer tradition, which is actually passing on to society a repository of cultural value that we need to actually keep society together. So that's just thinking off the top of my head. That's what I would say. I mean,
That's very interesting, and I think perhaps that essentially highlights the what what we may call the Illich paradox, in that he, I mean, his writing is very much imbued with the fervor and the fever of his time, of the 1960s and 70s. So it is rebellious, but
indeed,
it's a rebellion to go back to tradition,
it
perhaps,
yes,
right? So
yeah.
it's a so it's a contradiction in a
Mhm.
way. but it's something that traditionalists struggle today,
Mhm.
right? We all struggle with how do we, right the boat of modern societies that is completely right, that is in total disarray and sinking and
Dumpster
chaos and
fire.
whatnot, right? And how do we do it without being revolutionary, right? Without
Yeah.
the means of revolt, of revolution.
And I think this is what Edmund Burke's great insight was, is he recognized that the model of change, which the modern world loves now, which is revolution, you're just substituting one mafia for another.
Right.
That's all you're doing. You're substituting one tyrant for another, and been the modern superstition that we just need to get our guy as the leader. We need to get our mafia as the one in charge, and then everything will be okay. And it's like, no. Now the hard thing with the traditionalists, or the people wanting to go back to tradition, and I am one of these people. I believe in the value of tradition. Like, I love Edmund Burke's reflections and saw that he recognized the value of cultural societal tradition. But it's so hard to grab a hold of tradition in the modern world when we've already departed from it, and not simply try to replicate sometime in the past, because that's also not, properly speaking, what tradition is. Tradition is a handing over, a tradere, a handing over of cultural values from the past into the present. So tradition is not just a replication of some kind of a golden age. That's not what that means. To be traditional does not mean that we're trying to replicate some kind of idealist picture in the past. No, to be traditional means that there is in the past a repository of value and information that I need in order to flourish even now as a human being. And in many ways, to go back to that now, in the year 2021, it's very hard, because I mean, it's we are the great grandchildren of those who have already thrown it off. So it's
Right.
like,
Right.
what do we do?
Right. Yeah, no, you're right. But these are very good points. And in fact, I think it brings to me I don't have a solution to the question and the problem that Charlie posed, but it has to come. I mean, we know it has to come from the church, understood broadly. I mean, it has to come from God. I mean, it has to be a return to the tradition. I mean, since the right. I mean, the tradition, capital T, if you will, perhaps. I mean, it has to come through liturgy, through the worship of God, that society is retransformed. I have no idea how that is going to look, but I know that it can only come from God. I mean, it's only God that can, provide a solution to this dilemma we're facing, and that is neither a revolution nor a return to the past,
I completely,
but a way forward.
I completely,
And all I can say is, let's pray.
amen, amen. I completely agree.
Right. But maybe to add a little practical dimension to this, I'm looking to you, Charlie, as an exemplar of someone who's essentially living, trying to, you're not rejecting the fruits of modernity, but in a way you're rejecting what Illich is criticizing. In a way, you're trying to live, and in a way that is less dependent on these institutional monsters that have been created.
Yeah, I do think that we need more competition, which is another classical liberal idea that can be salvaged, and that the one size fits all model of the call it. Earlier we talked about globalism. I think it was in this Illich series. This may be in a different series that will take us out of the chronology, but I think that the global economy proposes a set of default institutions, whether it's the four-year university or the typical healthcare system, and I think that it is insulated from a certain kind of competition because of path dependence, because we've kind of gone down this road where it's just assumed that this is the only way that it can be done. And I think that part of the blame for the lack of competition is actually geographical in the sense that we've run out of frontier. There's no more space left on land, at least, where you can go out and try new ideas. So you had, at one time, the American frontier, which provided not only a place for religious minorities to flee persecution in the old country, but it also opened the door for the new ways of doing things, what we now know as kind of the American way, which
Yeah.
is more entrepreneurial, it's more dynamic, it really embraces creative destruction. But to some extent, maybe it even pushes out a certain kind of tradition or traditional mindedness.
Mhm.
And I think that the reopening of a frontier for groups that want to return to some sort of tradition is going to be a big thing going forward. So I have been a proponent of seasteading, which is like homesteading the high seas. And I should note that Illich is critical of the homesteading principle, where you merge your labor with the land and that produces private property. He seems to equate this with alchemy. But I still think that the formula holds up more or less, that, fundamentally, that's how you legitimately acquire property, is by mixing your creative juices and your the work of your hands with the stuff that's lying around that's freely available to everyone. Otherwise, we're locked into some sort of system of just handing down land and property from one generation to another. That's how new property is really made.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I think that, while I might be looking to the water, I'm sure that there is still plenty of opportunities on land. And one final comment today, I saw someone on Twitter saying, I want to start a community that's Amish, but where they drink alcohol and we use electricity and dancing is allowed, or something like that. And I commented, I said, I think there's a word for that. It's distributism. And that opens a whole can of worms. But
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I do think that there will be a movement where people are trying to get back to basics and flee the rat race. It'll go hand in hand with the homeschooling movement.
Mhm.
People that are just looking to escape from the modern hellscape that is the urban environments in the year 2021. I exaggerate, but
I
just for
think
dramatic.
those are great insights, Charlie. Exactly.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, I think, one thing about, so you mentioned modern, the educational institution and the healthcare institutions and the urban institutions, essentially the urban political institutions. Those are the themes that um, Illich is trying to destroy. And I think I'm certainly sold on the idea that they are sort of false gods. They're idols. I mean, essentially, in our, with the secularization of society, we've granted to those institutions, the divine powers, or at least we look, we expect them to have, to make us healthy, to make us knowledgeable, to give us wisdom, to, right,
Yeah.
all these things that we can only get from God. We sort of now have projected them onto these institutions. We've constructed them. It's our little Tower of Babel,
Yeah.
so to speak, and it's crumbling. And I think people see that. And um but so perhaps that's what's missing in Illich, is this ecclesial, at least a more explicit ecclesial dimension for a way forward. And um and I don't want to say ecclesial again, because he's critical of the ecclesial institution, and
Yeah.
perhaps for good reasons. We've talked about that
Mhm.
earlier. But ecclesial in a broader sense, that it really, the worship of God has to be informing all the changes that we go through individually, as we move forward or try to find our way out of this dystopia.
Yeah, whether ecclesial or not, it will, I think, happen, from within the church, and maybe that's the definition of ecclesial. In which case, that's another bone to pick with
Right.
Illich. But I like this line. I was trying to think of it off the top of my head, and I had to Google it. But it's Isaiah chapter 43, verse 19, and it says, "Behold, I will do a new thing. Now it shall spring forth. Shall ye not know it? I will even make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. And it's to me, it just I love that idea of God as someone who is full of surprises, and we never know what's going to come next. It's not backward looking. It's looking forward to a future of terraforming the deserts and
Mhm.
and finding a path through this crazy wilderness period that we're in.
Amen.
Amen to this. I think we can wrap it up here, but I found this the study of Illich extremely provocative and enlightening, and it's helped me mature my thinking on many different things. And do you guys want to have any final word about how you've
No,
confronted and wrestled with Illich? Yep.
yeah, I think exactly the same as you, Michelle. I found reading Illich a true wrestling with him, because he has so many great insights about modern culture, about the nature of the subsistence, particularly the nature of vernacular. What is the role of that vernacular arena within society, and his then dovetailing that with his critique of modern capitalism was challenging for me. He was challenging for me in a way that was good, because modern capitalism, for all the benefits that it has brought the world, is not free of critique. So we need to keep that open, and so I appreciate Illich for that.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. It's also, I just added, it's been a pleasure reading Illich and discussing him with you guys. And I feel like the mental calisthenics that it entails have made me better prepared for other think exercises in reading and thinking.
Great. On that note, I want to invite the viewers and listeners to continue to follow us, because we are going to continue this conversation, beyond Illich. There are many things, today, Charlie, you brought up a couple of points about private property, and I think that's worth discussing on an episode or two. So thank you everyone for listening, and just subscribe to the show, and keep following us.
All right.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.